So here's all this Yajilin by Jeffrey Bardon called pluses. You can see the clear geometry of the clues and the plus shapes. They actually play out as well in the logical part of the solve, I'm pretty sure. So we'll go through at the start, and I've turned on just the options for myself to shade some of these clues as I finish them, which will help us a bit. The zeros are pretty clear at the start, but in marking this one down here, we actually get two sure cells for the two to the left, and this sets up the first key tension in this grid, which is something that you should be able to recognize. We've got two loop ends down here that are going to have to get around and out of the grid. So if I look at, for instance, these these cells cannot belong to the same loop end in the loop place. This left end is going to be coming through this cell and going here. This right end has to get into the cell and get further out. And similarly, in these cells, in these cells, in these cells, and in these cells, these are still different ends. So if we've got the left here and the right here, this outer loop side will come through this outer line, do whatever it does down the bottom, come through this outer line on this side, and keep coming through these outer lines to stay apart, and this inner loop section will join with these inner ones along the plus shape. So we get one loop at the end of the day. The same thing can happen a little bit up top with these loop ends, which need to stay apart and give us this shape for that part of the grid as we get going. Marking in some of this loop shape, we actually have recognized where the two squares pointed out by this two right and two left clues go, and they go into these cells. And alongside that, this loop end and this loop end now have a constraint to kind of get around the square. If we came up here, we'd form an issue where this loop will close too soon, or if we came like this way, these ends would close too soon. And so what you'll see is that this comes to the right, this comes to the left, this similarly does the same, just so we get a valid place for the loop to get around this blackened square. And that's a good way to get some progress to mark into the grid. We've got this one down clue that we fulfilled. There are a set of places where in this grid marking some of the squares that are just off these corners will help you quickly see things you can mark. I actually haven't done that up here, but I think one of the places to start, this is actually the only square the one up clue can use. Because the rest are around corners or seen by the 0 to the right clue. There's a pretty neat deduction that's going to happen, I think, through this 1 down and 3 down clue, and that's because after we mark off these cornered cells, you'll see that we have a tension where in this 2 by 2 box we can't shade both of these cells. We can shade at most one, but notice that that gives me 1 option, 2 options, 3 options, 4 options for all the cells that are shaded in these columns. So each of these 2 by 2 blocks will take one square. I guess I can mark that in, but I need to shade one of these in blue. I've got to shade one of these in red, and so on coming down. Hopefully that's clear enough. What it then does is when I see I've got to shade one of these cells coming across is I can start to eliminate options. I can't really look at this cell and say much, but I can say if I shaded this cell, that would shade this cell, and that would form an issue right to the left of it. I'm making a three-way junction, which you can't do in one of these puzzles. And so when I say that this cell for sure isn't used, I now force my first shading on this rightmost set of columns. I must take this cell because, again, I've got to take 4 in this overall set of 2 columns, and I've got to take 1 in each of these 2 by 2 boxes. So I mark this in. That now means this left option for this one coming in this row would actually eliminate this cell in a bad way, so this has to be there. That completes the 1 down, but then leaves these behind for the 3 down, and we finish off these clues in this way. Let's go back to green. 1 comes across. This one to the right has just 1 option for it, and that's going to put the bend that we want to see down below. This completes this. This 2 clue now actually takes this and has to take this. So we get all the info for these clues now in the grid. This 3 down has 1 option, a second, and a third, and this is actually another space where we can mark cells around corners, but this cell is always shaded, this cell is always shaded, and I've got to take one of these 2, but now that I've marked some of the loop in, I've got to take the top one. So that's how I get to 3. This 3 up has 1 cell used and is going to need to take 2 more up here, but let's mark in some more cells we know aren't used. So got 1, 2, 3, and this 2 up takes this cell, and then one of these remaining ones, notice if I take this cell, I take this cell, and I leave a dead end in the grid. So I take the bottom one, which comes like this, that shades this option up top, and we've got these clues now fulfilled, and this clue fulfilled. We didn't come to it yet, but there's some of the same kind of Yajilin thinking for these 4 overall cells being taken in this 2x6 space. And one of the ways, just as we saw over on the side, is we can only take one of these cells up top, one of these cells down the bottom, which means I have to take 2 cells in this middle space to get a total of 4. Once these are marked, I can't take any square near that 2x2 box. It's got 2 cells taken because I'd make a pattern that's got dead ends. So this cell and that cell aren't used, so I've got to take these extremes. In taking those extremes, I intersect this pattern, which marks off those black squares. I've got 2 cells, neither of which I can shade to get this to work. So this is just cornering around the grid, and these loop ends staying apart. I've got this 1 clue finished, and I've got to fill in that cell. It looks like I've got some options still for the 3 up, so I'm not going to look at that yet. I can at least mark more of this in. These cells from the 1 across are done, and see if there's anything more. These clues are done. So now we haven't looked in this upper right space, but coming back to what we've been using in other zones to just mark off either or cells we can't take. This 2 actually just has 2 cells left to it. Sorry, 4 cells, the 2 spaces that you can put in. One of these will be shaded, one of these will be shaded. Notice that we have a risk of isolating loop ends in this upper left part of the grid if these are too close together. It's actually a case, and hopefully you can visualize this without me having to draw in all the loop, but if I took these 2 closest together, we're going to get these 2 loop ends without a way to escape. And if I actually took these 2 together, well, I get these loop ends in. I got another space of a little mini loop up here that doesn't have a way to get out. And so a familiar deduction we've done a lot of Yagilin is when you're in a cramped space, you often can't put the cells as close together as they may initially look to be possible. And so these clues around the 2 have to be spaced 2 apart. Getting that in that grid gives us a little bit more constraints in the space. We have this 5 getting some structure. We now have 3 cells marked in the whole column, 1 potentially to take down here, but we could take 2 up here or just 1 up here. And here again, if we just see the structure of the grid, if I took 2 up here, I have too many loop ends crossing into this upper right corner. I have 1, 2, 3, total of 5 open ends right now, and that's an odd number, so I can only take 1 of these cells up here. I take the last cell down in this space. This loop end dodges, which takes this cell, these dodge, this keeps coming down to avoid. That now means I think I've functionally, recognizing I take 1 of these cells in blue, I've marked off these clues just fine. So let's look back at clues I haven't used. I've got this 3 to the right clue, which will take 1 of these cells, and I've got this 4 clue, which looks to be the key one at this point. This has to take 1, 2, 3, 4 cells, and let me actually, I somehow have that not yet part of the path. But I've got these 4 cells, including this one I just marked in. I've got to take 1 of these as a space, and also then that's got to work with this 3 clue coming across. And one thing to see, and this is a tricky thing to see, is that there's an issue with potentially this cell and the cell just to the upper right. And that's because of the tension with how a cell here is going to finish 1, 2 parts of the grid, but then actually make this cell need to see 1, 2, 3 cells that are of the opposite parity of it. We're going to make effectively a 3 or 4-way junction with that shading. And so this is not the easiest cancellation to see, but we can't shade this cell. We have to shade the one above it. That moves this up. It means that to get the valid shading for this clue across, we've got to shade this cell. We now have a case where this end doesn't want to come in close to this end, so this comes up and this comes up, so we still have 1 loop. Marking that in, we get this look around here. We get this all completed out. This clue is used. This clue has its notes in the grid. This 3 up looks to be the last Yajilin clue to consider, so let's come to it. We actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 potential spaces, but we actually missed marking this. This is near a corner cell, can't be shaded, so actually only have 3 cells we can shade. So those are exactly shaded. This loop end needs to get out of the grid left or down so it doesn't come up here. So this has to corner like so. That corners like this. This is where a little bit of look ahead will help, but this loop end and that loop end don't want to connect. So for instance, in this space of cells, this has to have an end coming to the left. If it didn't, it would have a vertical and bottom when we close. It also means in this cell, you can ask yourself, does this get shaded? It doesn't get shaded because of the notes we have to the left. But if this comes down and to the right, you'll notice it also closes off the loop. And so from thinking of almost as something that comes up in Hamiltonian path type puzzles, but it's actually coming up in this Yajilin, seeing that this end has to come to the left forces the shading of these remaining squares in that column. And that gives us the start of this cornering, We've got to shade one of these cells that was in blue, and so it's the one I just marked. We got this coming down. This cell can't be reached. This cell is shaded. This comes in. These loop ends don't want to cross. These loop ends don't want to close. These come up, and the last piece is right here. So we finished this tough puzzle. Thanks, Jeffrey, for sending it. It's had really interesting use of geometry and then a fair amount of distant connecting clues. So a lot to track, but hopefully if you learned all the Yajilin trips through this video and other videos through this week, you were able to make all the progress through this puzzle. I think some of the key things were just recognizing, even if this basic 2-down pattern over here with how it's limited, this 1-3 pattern on the right side was a way, if you really have a sense of how clues interact and how you can only take so many shaded cells in a 2x2 box, can make headway through different parts of the grid. So hope you enjoyed the full Yajilin week, and we'll see you again soon.